Joining me today, Conservative MP Jake Berry, Labour MP Richard Burgon, Anne McElvoy of The Economist, and our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young. Today, 10 years in prison for breaching travel restrictions, foreign holidays on hold, until the whole world's vaccinated?
We'll need to wait for other countries to catch up as well in order to be able to do that wider international unlock.
The vast majority of our party and our movement are behind what we're doing. They know we're in the middle of a pandemic.
But this Labour MP thinks his party leader is failing to take the fight to the government. How will Keir Starmer fare at PMQs? We'll be there live at noon. Billions for owners of homes with unsafe cladding. But will it be enough?
We feel completely trapped and significantly worried. The stress and the strain on this is just overwhelming.
Let's start today's programme with a policy announced by Matt Hancock yesterday in the Commons. This is how some of the papers have covered it. The Guardian headline, COVID travel rule breakers face risk of 10 years in jail. And the Daily Telegraph's headline responding to it is 10 years in jail for holidaymakers who lie about going to Portugal. And this is for people who lie about their travel from high-risk or red-list countries when they arrive in the UK. They could face up to 10 years in prison. My question to our guest to start off with is, Jake, is that a proportionate response? Jake, we're not hearing you. You may be muted. Let's try you once more. Try again.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Good. Excellent. Well, I think it is a proportionate response because, in truth, we all have to play by the rules. We're in a national effort to tackle this COVID pandemic, and those people who break the rules and undermine that effort should be severely punished. I'm sure virtually no one will get 10 years in jail, but it is a real deterrent and something I support.
Right. Richard, what about you? It's the same as possession of a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence, rioting, making threats to kill. Is it proportionate?
Well, if people are forging documentation as to which country they've arrived from, if that puts people at risk, then tough action's needed. But my fear is that what the government's doing through this headline chasing initiative is trying to distract from the way they failed to deal with the coronavirus properly. I mean, the South African variant was discovered here over 50 days ago, and the government still hasn't got its act together. So I think whilst tough action's needed, if people are forging documents and the rest of it, we shouldn't be distracted from the need for a new strategy from the government, a strategy more like countries like New Zealand and Thailand, the zero COVID strategy. Because ultimately, the reason for the failure isn't due to individual members of the public, it's due to government failure on a whole host of things throughout this pandemic, sadly.
All right, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And on this issue, it's a headline, says Richard Burgon, about the 10 years in jail. Do you think it is the right response?
Well, I think it is the result of having had an on-off view of travel, and the fact is that a lot of people did take the opportunity to go abroad and are now kind of trying to figure out when and how they come back, and how do you manage that to not introduce more risk, particularly as the South African variant has turned out to be so dangerous. I'm always a little concerned when governments start bandying around long prison sentences, which I think we all know. I mean, kind of in a way, fortunately, we're not living in a society where people are going to end up serving 10 years in prison for contravening COVID rules, other than in absolutely excessive and criminal circumstances. So I do think they have to be a little bit careful with waving these draconian kind of threats around. It's much better, I think, to be consistent and to say to people that there is a serious downside for you and we will follow through on it. I think I personally would find that more of a deterrent than the headline today.
Right, Vicky, what law is actually going to be drawn up? There seem to be questions about how they're actually going to be able to do it, the government.
Yeah, and there wasn't much detail from Matt Hancock yesterday, and actually not that much pickup from Tory MPs on this yesterday. Now, later on, people like Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, talked about it. It appears that there's an old forgery law, so it is about forging documents, so not admitting or saying you've been to a different country when you come back from one of these ones on the red list. And I think what they're doing doing here, obviously, is trying to bring this in as a deterrent. And there aren't many people who think that in the end someone would be sentenced to 10 years in prison for all of this. But of course, the government has been under huge pressure, not least from Labour, to do more about borders. And I think yesterday as well, the quarantine hotels, the idea that £1,700 is what you're going to have to pay for a stay in a hotel, and calls for people, for the government to go even further on that and actually bring in that rule for other countries as well. So despite this sounding incredibly draconian, there's an awful lot of pressure to go even further, which I think is interesting, because I think people feel, many of them, there's been a huge sacrifice over the last few months. People have done an awful lot. Now that the vaccination programme is doing so well, the government certainly don't want to do anything to undermine that.
Right, well, let's talk a little bit more about the government's strategy with some of these policies. We can talk to Professor Adam Finn from Bristol University. Adam, welcome to the programme. We're seeing tough measures from the government at the moment. We've just been talking about this potential jail sentence if you lie about where you have travelled from when you enter the UK. Do you think the government's strategy on coronavirus is evolving?
Well, it certainly sounds like it. I know as much about the travel rules as you do from what I've been hearing on the media. My focus is mostly around the vaccine programme, as you'll know, but it does sound like things are moving, yes.
Right, and in terms of then their aim, is it possible to eradicate coronavirus?
Well, it's certainly we've certainly got examples of countries around the world where there is no circulation of the virus. The most well-known example is New Zealand, but Australia seemed to be pretty close to it. But of course, once you have some movement through borders, there's always the risk of reintroduction. You can't really eradicate a disease unless you do it worldwide.
Now, on that, if we have this vaccination programme being rolled out in the way it is, can vaccines eradicate COVID?
Well, another example of what's been achieved in the past is measles, which was effectively eliminated from North and South America. So vaccines against viruses can actually eliminate transmission of even a highly infectious virus like measles. So in principle, it's possible. But in practice, of course, it's often very challenging. And we've seen that with the polio eradication program, where completing the job has turned out to take a lot longer than we expected.
So what can we realistically expect from the vaccines that we have at the moment, and particularly with the discussion around some of the variants? Do we need to learn to live with this virus if the vaccines, as we're being told at the moment, will stop serious illness, hospitalisation and death, but not necessarily mild to moderate illness?
Yes, what we would expect from these vaccines, as with other viral vaccines, is that they will impact on milder disease and even asymptomatic disease, but not so efficiently as severe disease. So used at a population level with very high coverage, that adds up to a really significant effect. It's not so much the individual we're concerned with as the overall impact, if you like. And these vaccines do, I think, have the potential to drive down transmission of the virus and then to keep it down if they're widely used.
Right, so does the whole world need to be vaccinated, in effect, before we release all the restrictions?
You don't have to immunise every last person in the world, but you do have to immunise enough people to drive the R value down below 1 so that the virus circulation essentially dies out over time. So that's what you need to do. And there are several different phases to achieving that. It doesn't mean every single person in the world, but it does mean a pretty large majority, I'm afraid, yes.
OK, Adam, thank you very much. I mean, Richard, listening to that, you have been a supporter of what you call a zero COVID strategy. But as Adam is saying, it's not possible to eradicate it completely.
The purpose of a zero COVID strategy is to have the goal of elimination, which is different in scientific discourse from eradication. And if we look at the case study of New Zealand, for example, where there's been fantastic leadership from Jacinda Ardern, the Labour Prime Minister there, they're now having music festivals. And I saw last night on Twitter the Prime Minister attending a packed barbecue on a national holiday safely. These things are being done safely there. Normal life has returned more or less safely there because they pursued this strategy. So after a year where this government has presided over one of the highest coronavirus death rates in the world due to a number of really serious and avoidable errors, it makes common sense that the government should look elsewhere around the world, see where governments have succeeded, and then learn something from them.
All right, well, let me put that to Jake in just a moment. But Adam, just to respond to that, is he right, Richard, in what he's saying, the example of New Zealand? You can eliminate it.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I just said too. I mean, you can eliminate the virus. That was done in New Zealand, not by using vaccines, of course. It was done simply by implementing strict non-pharmacological interventions and then imposing very strict regulations at the borders. So they managed to do that last year before we had any vaccines. Vaccines actually add to the toolbox to enable that to be done. But it's certainly doable, but it's difficult, I would say. The bigger the country you have and the more connections internationally you've got, the more of a challenge it is. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Right. Well, should we have tried, Jake?
Well, I think it plays into what sort of country we want to be. I don't want to be a country that is entirely closed to the outside world in a way that New Zealand has made it. I want people to be able to go on their holiday with their kids in the summer to visit our friends and neighbours in Europe. And if that is the country we want to be, and it's certainly the country I think we should be, then the only way out of this is through vaccinating our population. And, no vaccine is going to eliminate COVID entirely until nearly all the world is vaccinated. But we can say in this country that by using things like the Oxford vaccine, a world-beating vaccine, that, the number of people, once the first most vulnerable cohort have been vaccinated who are going to die of this appalling disease, is cut by 90%. And that's the point at which, the government should be considering ways in which we can start to slowly unlock our economy, slowly try and return back to normal. Because, of course, all of these steps have been taken to ensure that our NHS isn't overwhelmed. And once we get to a position where our NHS isn't going to be overwhelmed and, most people are protected, then that surely is the time to unlock our economy and start to trade and travel around the world again. That, to me, seems to be the Britain I want to build back to, not a sort of closed society, as we've seen in countries like New Zealand. And, of course, once New Zealand and Australia start to reopen, they may have another problem with COVID. I hope they don't, but they may find that they have another problem with COVID if they haven't followed a similar vaccination strategy in which Britain leads the world.
Right, Adam, do you think that's right, that they could potentially have, countries like New Zealand and Australia, have problems once they do reopen?
Well, they definitely need to get their population immunised before they do that, for sure. I'd agree with that comment, because otherwise they'll have very large numbers of susceptible people, and the virus will spread just as it did last year. And then I think on the broader point, we will need to move further forward than this first phase, which is, as was correctly said, aimed at reducing hospitalizations and deaths, into a broader immunization program across the population before we fully open up, or we will just get another wave of cases again. So we're not in a position at the end of phase one to just kind of go back to normal. Absolutely not, because we'll once again be struck by another big wave of infection. We'll have another lockdown, and on we'll go. So we do need to do this very carefully, and we do need to get population immunity up to a much higher level before we can go back to normal activities.
Adam, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to move on to the story around cladding, because we're expecting the government to say something about it today. Now, this programme, Politics Live, has covered this story on a fairly regular basis over the last few years, and we spoke to Laura last summer, who has been affected by it. Let's listen to her tale.
We've been stuck in an area, in a flat, that is unsafe, and as I said, that has a real threat of ruining our lives. There is a high likelihood that we could get repossessed, that we could go bankrupt. And these are all quite dramatic phrases, but actually when you're faced with a bill of what will be at least tens of thousands of pounds, if not £100,000 for us personally as a couple, how you wake up every day worrying about it, every single day. And for me, that, and my husband, that stress has been so much worse and had a so much more negative effect on our mental health than, for example, my cancer diagnosis has. which is shocking.
I mean, a very traumatic experience for Laura and many other people. Vicky, what are we actually expecting the government to do? Because there's been talk about extra money. And how much is that likely to be? And will it sort of help everyone who is stuck in this situation?
Yeah, well, they've been under huge pressure over this. Of course, because of cases like that, you know, hundreds, thousands of people living in flats which they fear could end up, you know, going on fire, and they are feeling very much at risk. But then not just that, this is all about who pays to make it right. So there has been a fund, but it's not deemed to be anywhere near enough. Is it the property companies? Will there be some kind of levy on them to try and recoup some of the money? Now, the government, there's talk of billions of pounds that might be announced. But as you say, will it go to everybody? Will it just be for those in high-rise flats rather than those who are in low-rise flats? That's one thing. But Tory MPs, a sizable group of them, feel that actually this should cover everybody. And they have already tried to bring in an amendment to stop the property owners putting the bill onto leaseholders through service charges and that kind of thing. So they're under huge pressure to do an awful lot here to make this right.
Who should pay for this, Jake?
Well, the government. It's just really simple. I remember the appalling tragedy of Grenfell Tower. It was, in fact, my first day as a minister. I arrived in the housing department and was thrown in immediately to dealing with this just appalling human tragedy, seeing the death of so many people. Let's be absolutely clear, this is a failure of the building regulation regime. That regime was put in place by the government, in fact, a previous government in the case of Grenfell Tower. It is not the fault of the people who live in these buildings that they are a fire hazard, and the government should pay. And I might say this, during my time in the housing department, I had many battles with the Treasury, with ministerial colleagues to try and squeeze cash out of HMT. And I'm very pleased that finally the government has acknowledged that this is the right thing to do. And I absolutely support my Conservative colleagues and colleagues across the House of Commons who've been pressing for this. It's taken a very long time. Let's see what the announcement says today. But it's the right thing for the government to do.
All right, well, you're very clear in your position. We don't know, of course, exactly what the government is going to announce in terms of money, but let me just show everyone this tweet, if we can just bring it back up, from Pete Apps. Until it comes up, actually, I need the wording. Oh, here it is. My understanding is government set to announce funding for cladding removal work only on buildings above 18 metres. Non-cladding removal and below 18-metre blocks cost to remain with leaseholders, not yet confirmed. Would that be a mistake, Jake?
I think it would be, because, look, let's be absolutely clear about this. There are two potential people who should be held liable. Either the developer, if, in fact, the building was built outside the building regulations regime. That is a case clearly where developers or developers' insurers should pay. Or if it was built in compliance with the building regulation regime at the time the building was complete. That is a failure of government to set a proper building regulations regime, and therefore the government should pick up the tab. Whether you're in a high-rise building or a low-rise building, it is a failure of the government at the time. As it happens, it was a Labour government when many of these buildings that were done, but it is a failure of good governance of our building regulations.
All right, just before I bring our other guests in, though, Jake, just to be clear, our case study that you just heard from Laura, she was in a building of under 18 metres. So should she pay or should the government?
No, the government. I don't think I could have been clear about my view.
OK, fine. All right.
Where it is a failure, well, I just think it's an important distinction I'd like to make.
Yeah.
Where, it is a failure of the building regulations regime as brought in by the government, then it is clear that the government should pick up the tab. Where there are criminal activities by developers who've used the wrong type of materials, they should pay first. But if they fail to pay, it should be the government who steps in to support the leaseholders.
If the legislation doesn't include that, you'll vote against it?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what the announcement said. Well, I don't know what the announcement is going to say. I don't know if it... I doubt it is going to be the subject of legislation. I would have thought it is just the scheme that the government will bring in. Although I've been pushing since the day after Grenfell Tower, the appalling tragedy that happened there, for the government to pick up the tab. I don't intend to change my tune on the issue.
OK, well,
let's wait and see what happens.
Right, well, Richard, does that satisfy you? I mean, Boris Johnson was asked about this issue by Keir Starmer at PMQs last week. He said the government was determined that no one should have to pay simply to make their homes safe. So...
Well, first of all, I think we all need to reflect upon the fact that 3.5 years since the Grenfell tragedy, there's actually hundreds of thousands of people in this country still living in blocks with unsafe cladding. So safety is the first issue. And when it comes to leaseholders and others, they shouldn't be put in a position where they're under threat of going bust because of something which certainly isn't their fault. And whatever the government announces, it'll be too late, unless they want to surprise us all. It'll be too late for those leaseholders and first-time buyers who've already gone bust because of this issue.
And do you think they will go as far as including the government, people in buildings under 18 metres and other stuff that may be flammable but is not cladding?
I don't really know. I think the problem is that the government sort of has set a fairly high expectation. I don't think they, by the way, that they'll want to get entangled in a lot of legislative time on this, because ultimately, this is just something I think everyone agrees there has to be a line drawn under it. There has to be something that comes out of it, that it's clearly a safer and also more equitable outcome. But it is interesting if you look at the advocacy of people like Peter Bottomley in the Commons, that this is something that has, I think, probably taken the government by surprise how strong the feeling is on their own side about what has been landed on leaseholders. In the end, there will be a certain pot of money that they will want to spend, and I would guess that the schemes will be drawn up to fall within that. Not everybody is going to be happy. There's not going to be full liability for every building that conceivably could be seen to fall within this, falling solely on the government. I just can't see that outcome, whether it would be the right one or not.
I mean, Vicky, do you think they are surprised by the strength of opinion? I mean, Jake is very clear about he wants to see the legislation, or not the legislation, but what the government decides to actually do. But the strength of feeling and the number of people that have been affected is huge.
Yeah, but of course you've got lots of... They probably shouldn't have been surprised by it. You know, you have lots and lots of Conservative MPs who have constituents in this terrible position, who have been campaigning for these changes. And I think the point about how long this has all taken, it's not like this is a surprise. Everyone knew this was an issue. And I think lots of those Tory MPs would have hoped that this would have been resolved before now. There's clearly been a lot of toing and froing with the Treasury about exactly how they do this. Now, of course, if you're a minister, you are going to look to the companies, the property developers, to say, well, if you've done something wrong, then why aren't they paying up for this? Why should it be the general taxpayer? But I think that's the accommodation that they're trying to come to. And actually, if you look at the data, it's incredible that the cladding being removed and the repair work, it's been completed on only 58% of social housing blocks and 30% of private sector buildings. That's an awful lot of tenants and people sitting in places that they feel are unsafe.
Right, we're going to come back to this a little bit later, because that statement from Robert Jenrick, I think, is coming up fairly shortly after PMQs. Let's just show everybody this headline in the Daily Express. Keir Starmer facing leadership coup as ruthless Corbynites plot to oust Labour leader. Richard, you're quoted in this article more than once as being angry and outraged with actions by Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Do you want to get rid of him?
I think the Blairites have always been more ruthless than the left of the Labour Party in history.
Well, I'm not asking for a comparison, but I'm just asking if you want to get rid of him.
I want Keir to be Prime Minister. I want Labour to get into government. But to do that, we need to have a real look at where we are now. And the reality is we're in the biggest crisis for decades, and we're not sufficiently cutting through at the moment. Now, of course, the last election was a disastrous election result. It became the Brexit election that Boris Johnson wanted, but we need to move forward from that. And in most opinion polls, despite the fact that the government's inadequacies and failures and negligence has caused the deaths unnecessarily of tens and tens of thousands of people, over 100,000 people have died. Despite that, in most opinion polls, we're still a bit behind the Conservatives. So obviously, those of us who passionately want Labour to get into government, because my community needs Keir in number 10, my community needs Labour in government, we want the party to reflect where we are. And it seems to many people that the leadership has shown more enthusiasm for attacking the left in the Labour Party than it has for properly holding the government to account that's responsible for one of the highest coronavirus death rates in the world. And that can't go on. We need the Labour leadership to take the fight to the Tories, not take the fight to its own volunteers and members.
All right, I'll find out what you mean by it can't go on in just a moment. But Anne, what's your response?
Well, my response is that Richard is right, though not for the reasons I think that Richard says. Richard is right that Keir Starmer and the front bench is struggling. I don't think that their tactics and strategy are at all aligned. I've been writing today in the Evening Standard about the weakness of Annalise Dodds as Shadow Chancellor, and she's really going to have to, I think, kind of step up or step away from that role, and the budget will be a huge test for her. But you can't glaze over it as readily as Richard Bergen has just done. It was not just a Brexit election that Labour lost. It was an election it lost because the electorate found Jeremy Corbyn to be unpalatable and didn't want to have him in number 10. So these two things were going on at once, certainly. But Corbyn was a massive driver of voters away from Labour. So I think there's a sort of subtext, if I'm not wrong, that Richard is saying, well, we'd really like Keir Starmer to be a bit of a continuity fudge-mudge from the Corbyn years. Keir Starmer isn't going to do that. He won't win back voters that he's lost in the Red Wall seats. And he certainly won't win back any Tory voters across the line with that recipe. But where I do agree is there is a lack of cut through. There's a lack of strategy. Whenever I see Keir Starmer, Annalise Dodds, the top team, they just look miserable. This is a very difficult time, but people need a sense that Labour has a direction, and simply saying, I told you so, and looking morosely into virtual cameras on the political programmes is not going to get them far. So they clearly do need some sort of above room.
Right. What are you suggesting then, Richard?
Well, I think Keir could start by looking at the 10 pledges that he stood on, the 10 progressive pledges based upon those transformative policies from 2017 and 2019.
So it is a continuity Jeremy Corbyn then in that sense, as Anne was saying?
No, what I'm asking for is continuity from Keir with the pledges he made to the members. I think the 10 pledges he made to the members can offer us a way to cut through, because at a time of crisis, people are wanting leadership, people are wanting real answers to the huge problems they face. And one of the worst things that came out from that leaked document on strategy was people saying they weren't clear what Labour stands for. And that is really, really concerning, especially during a crisis. People are looking to us for practical answers, and we need to provide them.
Right. You were most angry and outraged, it seemed, by the actions to either remove or expel certain Labour Party members. Is that where your concern lies?
My concern is that it seems sometimes that the Labour leadership has the wrong priorities. I think the Labour leadership, for example, should be clearly calling for a zero COVID strategy, should be setting out in detail transformative policies based upon the 10 pledges that Keir made. If he does that, I believe that can be a reset of his leadership. I believe that can get us doing better in the polls. But when it comes to the suspension of Labour Party volunteers, secretaries and chairs, I mean, that's just the wrong target for a Labour leadership.
All right.
These are people who give up their spare time voluntarily. They are the beating heart of our party, and it's wrong to pursue them in that way. So the unfairly suspended CLP chairs and secretaries need to be reinstated.
All right.
Firstly, because it's the right thing to do, but also we need a united party to do well in these elections in May.
Does this sound like factions of old?
It sounds very like factions of old. I think I understand that Richard speaks for the grassroots and for the left of the party, and that that's perfectly right, and that's what he's in politics to do. But you can't forget that these are a group of people who drove the Labour truck into the ditch. So Keir Starmer would, I think, have right on his side also to say, look, I've had to pull this out of the ditch before we can start to get this party back on the road again. I don't think having grandiose plans for zero COVID strategies or whatever is going to save Keir Starmer's leadership or kind of reboot that sense. Because vaccines are really going to be what saves us this year. What Labour needs to do is be thinking about the economy. It needs to get back into that position where it is trusted on the economy. This is going to be a long game after COVID. That's where Labour's chance comes about. I think now trying to fight over what we all hope, fingers crossed, is the last few months before the vaccine is transformative for all of our lives is not the right use of their time. I just disagree on that. But I do think they need a serious economic message, and they need to explain how they're going to reboot UK PLC, where that differs from the Tories. And frankly, yes, they also need to be clear that this is not the continuity party for Jeremy Corbyn. As regretful as Richard and his friends will find that, that's not going to be the offer at the next election.
So what is all this about calling an emergency conference, Richard? What's that about?
Well, grassroots members and organisations, including some trade unions, have come up with this idea, which I and others have backed this grassroots idea. And actually, it gives a chance to Keir. For example, in June this year, Labour Party Women's Conference is taking place with policymaking powers online. That's great. We also think that in the context of this crisis, there should be a full Labour Party conference online as well.
Have you invited Keir Starmer along to this emergency conference?
Well, if the party decides to hold it, then Keir should definitely give a speech and set out his vision. Actually, it'd be an opportunity for him to bring the party together, reset his leadership, get us on the front foot, and put forward in greater detail the 10 policy pledges he made in the leadership election and how he's going to take...
Richard, if you were listening to this and everything that you're saying, that you want Keir Starmer to come to an emergency conference that you and trades union grassroots members have called because you want him to reset the policy, reset his leadership, and that he spent too much time focusing his fire on the Labour Party rather than Tories, I think most people would think you don't really like him as leader and you'd like him to go.
No, I want to see him as Prime Minister. I want to see him bring the party together. But, I mean, I remember, for example, when I was campaigning for Ed Miliband to be leader, he was regularly 10 points ahead in the polls. So we need to get into that position and better with Keir. And I think it's regrettable that the party is looking so inward at the moment. But
let me get your assessment. I mean, is he in any trouble here, Keir Starmer, from the challenges that are being posed by Richard Bergen?
I don't think so, because I think at the moment it is limited to people probably who supported Jeremy Corbyn in the parliamentary party. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that there isn't an issue for Sir Keir Starmer, and I think that's when the focus groups, the polling, if that's coming back from people saying they don't understand what he stands for, then of course that is a problem. Now, the people around him would say that there is a strategy. The first strategy, quite frankly, was to be not Jeremy Corbyn, and that's why he probably won't be listening that much to what Richard Bergen is saying. They feel that that was a disastrous general election campaign and he needs to break free from that. And a lot of people wouldn't have heard much from Sir Keir Starmer over the years, and it was about introducing him to the British public and setting out a strategy, including, we've heard a lot about, the flag, standing in front of the Union flag, patriotism, talking about loving his country, things they would say had been lost under Jeremy Corbyn. So that's the strategy. Now, he has got a problem that we are in the middle of a pandemic, and that means that usual politics, in a way, isn't operating. But there will, of course, come the point where he has to come up with policies, particularly, as Anne was saying, around the economy. What does Labour stand for post the pandemic? And I think that's going to be the big test for him.
And we're going to see him, of course, across the dispatch box with Boris Johnson in about 10 minutes' time. I'm going to draw your attention to this story that has emerged last night, and it's around a new law that the government is publishing to allow ministers to take maternity leave because, perhaps unbelievably, there isn't a law currently. The political editor of Newsnight, Nick Watt, tweeted this, saying a row's broken out in government over a special parliamentary bill to allow ministers to take maternity leave. Ministers are raising concerns because the bill says maternity leave is taken by persons. NHS guidance on maternity leave refers to women. I can show you a key part of the bill below. It says the conditions in this subsection are that A, the person is pregnant and it is no more than 12 weeks before the expected week of childbirth, and B, the person has given birth to a child within the previous 4 weeks. Jake, is there a problem with the wording?
Well, I think most people listening to this programme will think it's, a bizarre choice of wording. Look, I've been there for all three of my children being born, and I read in the papers today that an NHS trust in the south of England is looking at stopping using the words mother's milk, stopping talking about breastfeeding. In a way, I think that disempowers women who want to, have that maternal experience. I don't want people to be made uncomfortable about language, but I do think that we want to live in a country where women and men and parents can use whatever language they feel comfortable with without this sort of nanny state telling you that you need to, speak in a certain sort of way, in a gender neutral way. I'm really pleased my kids, fed on their mother's milk, and I just think it's government interference where the government shouldn't be, frankly.
Richard, what do you think? Is the wording wrong? Should it be changed?
Well, I saw the Daily Mail making much of this row about the wording today, and that made me somewhat sceptical about whether this is the key issue. I think the key issue with this is in relation to maternity pay. The government's fond of talking of levelling up.
Can I just get your point? Because that's what we're talking about here, is whether or not the government is going to consider changing the wording, which says in the law, as I say, the person is pregnant and is no more than 12 weeks before the expected week of childbirth. The person has given birth to a child within the previous 4 weeks. Should it stay like that, or should it be replaced with woman?
Well, I think this is distracting from what the crux...
I want to know your view.
Well, by the way.
I want to know your view.
Let me finish if that's OK.
Well, as long as you answer the question afterwards.
This is suiting the government's agenda because the story started with a government minister having an improvement to maternity leave, which is necessary. And the government's fond of talking about levelling up. So let's talk about, as the TUC has done, ensuring that there's better maternity leave for all women. Let's talk about that. So there's better maternity leave for people across the board. So there isn't a two-tier maternity system. So let's level up in that sense.
Right. And should it be people or women in the law, in the writing?
Well, I think that's, a distraction. I think that this is the kind of culture debate that the right-wing press have tried to run in the 1980s before. I remember, right-wing newspapers talking with great glee about saying that teachers were banned from saying blackboard and all the rest of it. Yeah. I think it distracts and divides. So you're happy with the way...
I'm just asking your view. Yes, the government may be tying itself up in knots, but what's your view? Jake mentioned this story. It's the Brighton and Sussex Hospital NHS Trust. It's also in the Mail. You'll be pleased to know, Richard. Hospital tells doctors, nurses and midwives to say birthing parents and human milk instead of mothers and breast milk because they risk offending transgender people. Is that the right way to go? Should other trusts follow Brighton and Sussex?
Well, the Daily Mail clearly has an agenda in amplifying that story. What we want to see is a realisation of the discrimination that trans people across this country and around the world face.
Right.
The levels of hate crime they face.
Should your hospital trust then do the same?
What we also want to see is better maternity pay rights and an end to discrimination against women in the workplace and in society. Whereas what the Daily Mail and right-wing Conservative politicians want us to do is have endless debates on television about the use of language.
Right. Anne, what's your view to this?
Well, I'd say 3 children, 2 of whom were born during election campaigns and slept around.
Badly timed.
I honestly say, I think you've got the pelvic floor exercises and the aftermath of the birth to deal with. You're probably in the mother camp on this one. I think this kind of language is like a clunky attempt by official language to sort of cover up that concern about sensitivities and, frankly, campaigns from the trans communities. It's always going to end up sort of landing awkwardly in the middle. I think if you're saying if a trans couple or one member of the trans community is bringing up a child, should they be entitled to things that help them and to payments, etc., have that argument. I think the way not to do it, and this I do slightly agree with Richard Bogan, the way not to do it is simply to say, well, you can sort of fix the language and that will be enough. If you really want to talk about whether you're treated in the same way if you're a trans person parenting a child as maternity leave, have that argument. But I'm afraid maternity, it's for mothers.
Right, but the symbolism is important, isn't it, Jake?
Well, if I'm completely honest, I don't think any parent wants the government interfering and telling them, I frankly do not care what a hospital thinks that it should call a mother's milk or breastfeeding or chest feeding. I can tell you the last thing in my mind, the birth of my 3 children, is what language the hospital was telling me they thought I should be using. In truth, I think it's a load of woke nonsense. I think the hospitals should roll back, let parents be parents, let mums be mums, let dads be dads, let transgender couple be parents and mums and dads and whatever they want to be. Just get out of our way and let us get on with living our lives. It's a load of nonsense. It's frankly a waste of time. And I don't think the hospitals should be engaging in it.
Vicky, what's the government doing?
Well, they are running around at the moment trying to sort this out because there is it's a pressing issue, not least because the reason this is coming in so quickly, they want to rush it through all its parliamentary stages tomorrow, is because the Attorney-General, Suella Braverman, is about to give birth in the next couple of weeks, so they need to get this in place. Now, what they're trying to work out is why this language has appeared. Is it because lawyers say it has to be written in that way to make sure that it covers everybody, or is it for some other reason, and are they going to have to change it through an amendment? Now, this bill has already been introduced, so that is a problem. It will have to be amended, they think, if they really believe that Conservative MPs maybe wouldn't back it because it has this language in it. Now, it's being taken through the Commons by the Paymaster General, Penny Mordaunt. So the question is, and someone has said to me in government, that there have been some raising of eyebrows amongst ministers because they think that maybe she has been the one behind this language, and that might not chime with what some other ministers who have an equalities brief necessarily want in there.
Right, Jake, will you back it in its current form then, that wording?
Well, I just personally think the language is a complete irrelevance. People don't
but it's
want
an
the
issue.
government telling them.
The government...
Well, I don't. No, sorry. Well, I disagree with you. I don't think it is an issue. I think the language
I'm not
is irrelevant.
I think
it is. I think it's nonsense. I think this is civil servants sort of, trying to, cover every base. I personally think it should say women. It won't stop. The fact that it says person won't make me vote against it, because I think it's hugely important that both women and men in this country have their full maternity and paternity rights. And I don't think one word out of place should stop MPs backing female members of parliament or ministers getting their maternity leave, nor should it stop them backing male members of parliament getting paternity leave. I just think it's a bit of a non-issue, but I just think it's symptomatic of a civil service that is perpetually navel-gazing, perpetually worrying about these issues, which in the real world have no bearing or impact on people's lives.
Well, it sounds like it's ministers, actually, who are worrying about it, potentially. Richard, will you back it, this piece of legislation, in its current form with the wording as it is at the moment?
Well, I'll have a look at the legislation. What I want to back tomorrow is an opportunity for better maternity rights and maternity pay for everyone, not just for government ministers.
Yeah, but I'm asking about this particular law, which is about ministers, because, as we explained last week, a law doesn't exist at the moment, and they've had to rush this through for the Attorney General. So
right.
You're going to be asked to vote on it. Will you or won't you?
Yeah, it's right. Yeah. It's right that this change is made so that Suella Braverman and other ministers can have proper maternity leave. Let's use this as an opportunity to reflect upon the fact that in our society, maternity leave and paternity pay and maternity pay aren't in a good a position as they should be. Let's level up for everyone on this, not just for government ministers.
Anne, final word on this before we move on to PMQs.
It is interesting how these little culture war linguistic spats are now beginning to sort of encroach, I think, on Whitehall and on the language that ministers use. I'm pretty sure Vicky's onto something. There's a bit of an argument going on there about what the Conservative equalities view should be on this. I don't think it's the last we'll hear about it, I say, speaking as a mother.
Thank you for that. Vicky, PMQs, what will Keir Starmer go on, do you think, today?
Well, he might repeat last week in some ways by talking about borders. So the accusation from Labour for some time has been that the government just hasn't been tough enough on this, that they should have done more about people coming into the country. 10, 11 months ago when some other countries did do that. Now, what's interesting is that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary in the Commons yesterday, said he'd been talking to counterparts in Australia, for example. Now, we do know they've gone an awful lot further than this government. And there has been this moment, of course, where they announced people were going to have to go into quarantine in hotels and pay for the privilege of that. But, of course, it's still not actually in place, so not due to be in place until Monday. So I think there'll be more questions around that, and really for Labour about why is that list only of just over 30 countries. How can you be sure where the next variant is going to come from? If that's what you're trying to stop coming into the country, then shouldn't it be more broad than that? At the moment, though, the government is reluctant to go down that road.
Should it be extended, that list, Jake?
Well, if the facts change, then the list should be extended. We need to keep it under constant review.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there because it's time for Prime Minister's questions. Let's go into the chamber.
My duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Gary Sambrook. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last week, thousands of people across Frankly Great Park and South Northfield have done what's been asked of them to go and get a test because of a small number of South African variant cases in the constituency. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking Dr Justin Varney and Councillor Simon Morrell and Birmingham City Council for everything they've done to be able to scale up mass testing across Frankly Great Park, and encourage anyone who hasn't had a test so far to get one at one of the designated sites?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for raising it. I join him in thanking the NHS staff who are scaling up the surge testing in the way that he describes, and I encourage everybody in the area and indeed throughout the country to get a vaccine when you're asked to do so.
Let's come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by thanking everybody involved in the vaccine rollout? We've now vaccinated, I think, 12.6 million people. We're on course to vaccinate the first 4 priority groups by the end of this week. That's a truly amazing achievement. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that the government will extend business rate relief beyond March 31st?
I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear him join in praise of the vaccine rollout, which is indeed, I think, a tribute to the NHS staff and the Army, the volunteers, and many, many others. And on his point about the extension of business rate relief, he knows that this government is committed to supporting businesses and people, livelihoods throughout the pandemic. That is what we will continue to do, but he should wait until the budget for the Chancellor to explain exactly what we're going to do.
Mr. Speaker, I think that answer was that the Prime Minister can't give an answer yet. But hundreds of thousands of businesses are affected by this. And the trouble is, Mr. Speaker, that businesses don't work as slowly as the Prime Minister. They need an answer now. As the British Chamber of Commerce says, businesses simply can't wait until the March budget. Let me try another vitally important question for businesses and for millions of working people. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that the furlough scheme will be extended beyond April?
Mr. Speaker, I think most people in this country are aware that we're going through a very serious pandemic in which rates of infection have been steadily brought down thanks to the efforts of the rich people. I think also members of this House are familiar with the notion that in just a few days we will be setting out a roadmap for the way out of this pandemic, a roadmap that I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues will support. Though the support, as we know, tends to be a transitory thing, Mr. Speaker. One week we have it, the next week we don't. But he won't have to contain himself for very long.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me let the Prime Minister into a secret. He can take decisions for himself, and he doesn't need to leave everything to the 11th minute. If I were Prime Minister, I'd say to businesses, we'll support you now. We'll protect jobs now. Because the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Institute of Directors and the British Chamber of Commerce have all said the same thing. They all say, Prime Minister, they can't wait until the budget. The Prime Minister may disagree with me, but he's actually disagreeing with businesses. Why does the Prime Minister think he knows better than British business?
Mr. Speaker, I think that most business people that I've talked to a great many in the last 12 months would agree that there is no government around the world that has done more to support business, wrapping our arms around business. And actually, I'm delighted to hear this enthusiasm for business from the Labour Party when they stood on a manifesto to destroy capitalism at the last election, and indeed to dismantle the very pharmaceutical industry, Mr. Speaker, that has provided the vaccines on which we now rely. Will he now repudiate that policy, Mr. Speaker?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we all know what the Prime Minister once said he wanted to do to business. We on these benches would rather listen to businesses. So we've no decision on business rates, no decision on furlough. Let's try another crucial issue. And Prime Minister, no excuse for delaying this time, because this has to be decided before the March budget, and the Prime Minister doesn't need to check with the Chancellor. So will the Prime Minister now commit to extending the evictions ban on residential properties beyond February the 21st?
Mr. Speaker, I've said repeatedly that what we will do in this government and throughout this pandemic is put our arms around the British people, support them throughout the pandemic, and make sure that people are not unfairly evicted during the pandemic. That is what we will do. What I hope very much, Mr. Speaker, is that we may hear from the right honourable gentleman opposite that he not only has now had a Damascene conversion to the importance of business, but a Damascene conversion to supporting all the government's policies to support business, rather than sniping from the sidelines. Why doesn't he just get behind us and back the government, back us in our efforts to back business and back the British people?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take lectures from a man who wrote 2 versions of every column he ever wrote as a journalist, who proposed Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize and gave Dominic Cummings a pay rise. Back to the question. Another area where the Prime Minister repeatedly delayed and now changes policy pretty well every day is securing our borders against variants of COVID. Every week the Prime Minister comes here and says we've got one of the toughest regimes in the world. We know his Home Secretary disagrees with him. We know the Health Secretary disagrees with him. Luckily, Mr. Speaker, Oxford University keep track of how tough border restrictions are in every country. They say that there are at least 33 countries around the world which currently have tougher restrictions for the United Kingdom. 33, Prime Minister, including Canada, Denmark, Japan, Israel. There are many others. In fact, they say we're not even in the top bracket of countries for border restrictions. 50 days after we first discovered the South African variant, 50 days. How does the Prime Minister explain that?
Mr. Speaker, there are some countries in Europe that do not even have a hotel quarantine scheme, such as the one we're putting in on Monday. We have amongst the toughest border regimes anywhere in the world. And people should understand that on a normal day, Mr. Speaker, at this time of year, you could expect about 250,000 people to be arriving in this country. We've got it down to about 20,000, 5,000 of them whom are involved in bringing vital things into this country, such as medicines and food, as we discussed last week, and he agreed that was a good idea, Mr. Speaker. Unless he actually wants to cut this country off from the rest of the world, which I think last week he said he didn't want to do, unless, of course, he's changed his mind again, Mr. Speaker. I think that this policy is measured, it is proportionate, it is getting tougher from Monday. I hope that he supports it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is this. The Prime Minister is failing to give security to British businesses, and he's failing to secure our borders. The Prime Minister often complains that we never put forward constructive proposals. So here's 2 for him. Support businesses and protect jobs now by extending furlough, business rate relief and VAT cuts for hospitality. And second, secure our borders with a comprehensive hotel quarantine on arrival. No more delays. Will he do it?
Mr. Speaker, we've just announced the quarantine policy, which, as I've said to the House, is amongst the toughest in the world and tougher than most other European countries, certainly. I'm delighted that he's now supporting business in his latest stunt of bandwagoneering, not a policy for which he was famous before, Mr. Speaker. But he moves from one side of the other in the debate throughout this crisis. And some people, Mr. Speaker, some people have said that this is a good crisis. Mr. Speaker. Some people have said this is a good crisis. Some people have said that this crisis is a gift that keeps on giving, Mr. Crisis. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, those people sit on the Labour front bench. I think it is disgraceful that they should say those things. I believe this is one of the biggest challenges this country has faced since the Second World War. And thanks to one of the fastest vaccine rollouts anywhere in the world, I believe it is a challenge this country can meet and is meeting. And I believe that of that vaccine rollout programme, this House and this country should be very proud.
Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for the decisions he took last year that have meant that the vaccine programme is in such a good position this week. Despite that success, it is vital that that programme keeps pace with the changing variants. Can he update the House on where the UK stands on ensuring that the UK supply chain is in place and that we don't get behind as the virus mutates?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend asks an extremely important question, and that's why we recently announced an agreement for 50 million doses with the manufacturer CureVac, because we believe that that may help us to develop vaccines that can respond at scale to new variants of the virus. And as the House will have heard from the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and others, I think we're going to have to get used to the idea of vaccinating and then revaccinating in the autumn as we come to face these new variants.
Let's head up to Skye and Lochaber with SNP leader Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the baby bank charity Little Village has revealed that 1.3 million children under 5 are living in poverty in the United Kingdom. This is a truly shocking figure that should make this Tory government utterly ashamed. The Scottish National Party has repeatedly called for a financial package to boost household incomes and reverse this Tory child poverty crisis. The Prime Minister has the power to tackle child poverty right now by making the £20 uplift to universal credit permanent and by extending it to legacy benefits. The Tory government's been stalling on this for months. Will the Prime Minister finally act, or will he leave millions of children out in the cold?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House in this country should be proud of the way we've tried to look after people, the poorest and neediest families throughout the country, not just with universal credit, which the party opposite would actually abolish, Mr. Speaker, but by helping vulnerable people with their food and their heating bills, the £170 million winter grant scheme, looking after people with the free school meal vouchers. And as I've said before, Mr. Speaker, we all put our arms around the people of this entire country throughout the pandemic.
Let's return to Scotland with Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that was pathetic. That was no answer. We're talking about 1.3 million children under
Mr Prime Minister, we both know that you're only teasing him and we're trying to wind up the leader of the SNP. Please, let's drop it. Let's move on, because Lee Anderson is waiting for you. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A new Freeport for the East Midlands will create over 60,000 new jobs and provide a massive boost for employers such as Cornton Engineering and Abacus in Ashfield. After decades of neglect from Labour MPs, we now feel a sense of hope in the red wall seats. My mum and dad voted Conservative for the first time at the last general election and were touched when the Prime Minister acknowledged their votes were lent. Could my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, please reassure my mum and dad, my friend, my family and all my constituents that our area will never be let down again?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for everything he's doing for Ashfield, and he and I have had enjoyable times campaigning for the people of Ashfield, and we'll continue to do so. And I can tell Paul and Jenny that our commitment to levelling up is absolutely rock solid throughout this country.
I said to marry on it with Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. We've just heard the government claims to have a levelling up agenda, underpinned by a research and development roadmap. The trouble is, the Tories' track record on this isn't good. In fact, it's abysmal. Wales receives the lowest R&D spend per person of the four nations, at around 40% of spend per head in England. And Westminster's obsession with the golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London shows no sign of abating. Will he now commit to a fairer, devolved R&D funding settlement to the Senedd? Or is he content for Westminster's roadmap to be Wales's road to nowhere?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm afraid I think she's doing Wales down, and the people of Wales down, and the ingenuity of Wales down, because I think about a quarter of the airline passengers in the world are borne aloft on wings made by the Welsh aerospace sector, Mr Speaker. Bridgend is going to be one of the great centres of battery manufacturing in this country, if not the world. Wales is at the cutting edge of technology under this government's plans for a record spending on R&D, £22 billion by the end of this Parliament. Wales, along with the whole of the rest of the UK, will benefit massively.
I said to Cheshire with Dr Ciara Mullen. Dr Ciara Mullen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The UK has fallen behind Europe in untapping the potential of geothermal heat and energy in places like Crewe. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can ensure geothermal helps us build back better with a revitalised package of incentives for industry?
I thank my honourable friend for the excellent point he makes about Crewe and the way it's now in the forefront of deep geothermal energy exploration, and very happy to meet with him to discuss what we can do to further geothermal energy in Crewe, diary permitting, Mr Speaker.
Let's wander up to Bolton with Yasmin Qureshi. Yasmin.
Mr Speaker, this government said that no council would be suffering as a result of the pandemic. And the Chancellor said that he would do everything, whatever it takes, to help them. Yet the Tory-controlled Bolton Council has just announced 35 million cuts in pounds and an increase in the council tax budget for 3.8%. Can the Prime Minister assure my constituents and my town that that money will be given to them, or will this join a long list of Tory failed promises?
Minister. I want to congratulate, Mr Speaker, the great Conservative-controlled Council of Bolton for everything they're doing and continue to do throughout this pandemic to look after the people of Bolton. I know what incredible work local officials do, and I thank them very much for it. And we believe, since we believe so strongly in local government, Mr Speaker, as a creature of local government myself, I'm proud that we've invested £4.6 billion in supporting local government just so far in this pandemic.
Sajid Javid.
Mr Speaker, from rainforests to coral reefs, the world's ecosystems are at risk of catastrophic decline. That was the conclusion of the Dasgupta review last week, which my right honourable friend rightly welcomed. This threat to our biodiversity is not just a moral failure, it is economically short-sighted too. When I asked Professor Dasgupta to carry out this work, he told me that it would not be complete until after the UK had hosted the COP26 summit. But now, given that the summit has been delayed until later this year, and that it will take place alongside our presidency of the G7, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK has been presented with a unique opportunity to show global leadership on how we can better protect our most precious asset, nature?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. I thank him for what he's doing himself in this area, and I want the House to know that we want our COP, the UN COP26 summit, to be a landmark event, not just for tackling climate change, but also in biodiversity. And I think it's high time that the leaders of the world took a step to reverse the loss of habitats and species that we've seen over the last century.
Let's head up to Oxfordshire with Layla Moran. Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's estimated that up to 400,000 people are living with the debilitating effects of long COVID, and some of these are NHS heroes who caught COVID in that first wave. Nearly a year later, I've heard from a doctor who says she wonders if she'll ever be able to walk unaided again, let alone manage a full day of work. Does the Prime Minister recognise that for this group, long COVID is an occupational disease? And will he set up a compensation scheme similar to what we offer our armed forces, so that we ensure that those who have lost their livelihoods by saving lives are fully supported?
Thank the honourable lady, because she's right to highlight the incredible sacrifice and effort of NHS staff, many of whom sadly have contracted COVID in the course of their duties, and a great many of whom have sadly continued to be affected by that disease. We must study the long-term effects of COVID and make sure that we continue to look after our wonderful NHS staff throughout their careers.
To Yorkshire with Julian Sturdy. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that all students will be back in school no later than the 8th of March and commit to starting any phased return straight after half term, so that the really damaging effects of being away from school are not drawn out for any longer than is absolutely necessary?
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly confirm that we're going to do everything we can, and I know that that's the settled will of most people in this House, to get our kids, get school children back on March the 8th, if we possibly can. I'll be setting out for my honourable friend as much as we can say on Monday, and then in the week of the 22nd, we'll be setting out a roadmap and setting out the way forward for schools. But we've got to make sure we keep this virus under control, Mr. Speaker. It is coming down, but we cannot take our foot off its throat.
Let's head up to the North East with Ian Mearns. Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Having sat on the HS2 Hybrid Bill Committee for 15 months, I was a sceptic as to the economic benefits of the project for the North East. But HS2 is going ahead, at least in the south. It's therefore crucial that the eastern leg of HS2 goes ahead, not just for Yorkshire and the East Midlands, but also for the North East. The Prime Minister has made repeated promises to the people of the North East of his intention to level up and to connect and create opportunities for people here in places like Gateshead. So as we strive to recover from the damage done to so many families and businesses by the pandemic, will the Prime Minister commit to beginning the work on the eastern leg of HS2, starting in the North East, to run simultaneously with the construction in the south, so that our region is not forced to wait another couple of decades for 21st century rail connectivity?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly confirm that we are going to develop the eastern leg as well as the whole of the HS2, and he'll be hearing a lot more about what we're going to do with our national infrastructure revolution, Mr. Speaker, and about what we're going to do to improve not just rail transport, but road transport as well in the North East.
Let's head south to Caroline Nance, lose audio only. Caroline Nance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no shortage of commitment or compassion in my town of Eastbourne for homeless people who are vulnerable and need complex support. However, neighbouring Brighton continues to send its homeless to our town, and we do not have the resources to meet this need. 3 homeless people have died, and I believe there will be inquests. Brighton is not engaging with Eastbourne's council in any meaningful way, and a further 51 placements have been made in recent weeks. Will my right honourable friend join with me in urging immediate engagement from Brighton and Hove council leaders on this as a matter of urgency?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Brighton Council and East for cooperating with Eastbourne Council in getting this done. There must be cooperation. No one in this country should be living rough or sleeping or homeless, sleeping rough or being homeless as a result of this pandemic, or indeed through any other cause, Mr. Speaker. We've invested $700 million this year to help people off the streets. It continues to be a national priority, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, for what he's doing and the various task forces that are currently at work to prevent people coming out on the streets again as we lift the restrictions.
Let's head to South Wales with Geraint Davis. Geraint.
Mr. Speaker, at DVLA in Swansea, there had been 526 cases of coronavirus since last September, when the Prime Minister told us, at Prime Minister's Question Time, all staff who can work from home are working from home. Yet in March last year, 250 people were working on site. Now the numbers are in their thousands, facing a more infectious and widespread disease. And yesterday, 90 people were sent home following the latest outbreak of coronavirus just before the weekend. So given that BT are on standby to install home secure technology to allow home working, will the Prime Minister meet with me and the union PCS ahead of the strike ballot next week so that workplace numbers can be reduced until the vaccine is rolled out to keep people safe and to avoid an unnecessary strike?
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for raising this again with me, and thanks to the working from home strategy that the DVLA has been pursuing of a workforce of 6,000. There are currently thankfully, 9 cases, to the best of my knowledge, of COVID, and 3 of those individuals are currently working from home. We're rolling out lateral flow tests. A huge number of lateral flow tests are being distributed to the DVLA. But the long-term solution, Mr. Speaker, or the medium-term solution, I should say, is to vaccinate and to roll out the vaccination programme. And that is what this government is doing in Wales and across the country.
Let's head to the West Midlands with Nicola Richards. Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Families across West Bromwich East have been affected by cancer, just like my own, and know all too well that early diagnosis and treatment can save a life. According to research by Macmillan Cancer Support, there were over 70 people in my constituency and 50,000 across the UK with a missing cancer diagnosis. Cancer hasn't stopped during the pandemic, so with this in mind, will the Prime Minister commit to making the resurgence of cancer diagnosis services a top priority as restrictions begin to ease?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I know this is an issue that is very close to her heart, and she's right to raise it, because we, of course, there are the pressures from COVID, but we're also worried, Mr. Speaker, that some people may not be coming forward for the cancer treatments that they need. So I urge everybody who needs to get their treatment to help the NHS to help you come forward and get your treatment as you normally would.
To the North West with Lucy Powell. Lucy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said in November that the £1.5 billion Green Homes grant would be extended to March 2022. Yet in a written answer last week, his minister said that the money would not be carried over from this financial year to next. With just 7 weeks to go, a paltry £71 million has been spent so far. So why is he cutting £1 billion from the Green Homes grant that he promised for businesses, homeowners and the environment?
She's on to something, but she's barking up the wrong tree, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the Green Homes grant is not that we're not cutting it. The problem is there hasn't been enough take up, and we want to encourage people to take it up and make use of the opportunity to reduce the carbon emission of your homes.
Let's head south to Sir Roger Gale. Sir Roger.
The Prime Minister has said, and he's written in his foreword to the Environment White Paper, that he's pledged to protect the countryside. Mr. Speaker, the countryside is more than just a bit of green belt around the home counties. In Westgate and Birchington and Herne Bay, in my own constituency, and indeed across much of the Garden of England, there are plans to smother acres of prime agricultural land in housing that is not needed for local people, but that is needed and required to grow the crops to reduce the amount of food that we import at a cost of carbon emissions. So if the Prime Minister is the friend of the countryside, will he announce an immediate moratorium on the use of all farmland for housing while the whole policy is reviewed?
Mr. Speaker, I think I just heard the honourable gentleman say that he wants an immediate moratorium on the construction of all housing. Maybe I misunderstood. I don't think that to be realistic. But what I can certainly tell him is that we will take very seriously the points he makes. I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, has met him and will be glad to meet him again to discuss the subject he raises. But this government's commitment to nature and to the countryside is unmatched. We've just consecrated 30% of our land surface, Mr. Speaker, to nature.
Let's head up to Airdrie with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a meeting recently with the PCS about public sector pay and heard from constituents in Shotts and Calderbank who work for UK government departments. Both are struggling to cover over a real terms pay cut over decades. One has had to take partial early retirement so the lump sum could keep him going. What will the Prime Minister say to the Chancellor to convince him of the need to properly reward all those who have been on the front line during the COVID pandemic and at the very least follow the Scottish Government's lead in fully funding a rise in public sector pay?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen above inflation increases in public sector pay, and that is quite right. And we support particularly increases in investment in our NHS, and you'll know the package that we put in place for nurses. But the single best thing that we can do is support the living wage, which this government introduced and which this government introduced and which we have now increased by record amounts 2 years in a row. And I see the Scottish Nationalist Party, forgive me, Mr. Speaker, National. I don't know whether they're nationalists or not. Perhaps they could clear it up. Whether they think, maybe are they
did up earlier for you?
Are they a national party without being nationalists? It's an interesting semantic point, Mr. Speaker. I think they're trying to claim that they pioneered the living wage. I don't think that's right, Mr. Speaker. I seem to remember that it was a certain mayoralty in London that massively increased the living wage when they weren't off the starting blocks, Mr. Speaker.
In which case, let's go down to Somerset, who is ready on the starting blocks with Ian Littlegranger.
Mr. Speaker, thank you as always. I am delighted my honourable friend is defending democracy by pushing ahead with local elections. But here in the land of King Alfred, the people desperately want to give their verdict on Somerset County Council, which I'm afraid has been using COVID money to spend on things that have nothing to do with the pandemic. They have submitted to the government a form which says nothing, and I fear that my right honourable friend has been misled. We need a referendum down here to test public opinion quickly. But would my right honourable friend, a proud man of Somerset, who understands history more than most of us, not agree the time has come to put our county back together and that we have the whole of Somerset being looked after by Somerset? I know King Alfred would approve of it, and I know the people of Somerset will certainly support the Prime Minister if he supports us.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, who is a great advocate of Somerset and committed to his constituents, and I thank him for what he's doing. He's raised this now twice with me, and I thank him for that. But my humbly suggest that the best way forward is for the consultation to proceed and for local people to decide what the best form of government, local government, is that they want.
Let's head for our final question from Northern Ireland with Gregory Campbell. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, you're aware now of the problems we warned about over many months before the Northern Ireland Protocol was introduced. These problems are scheduled to get worse from April. Can you outline a timeline where people in Northern Ireland, and indeed all across the UK, as indicated in the e-Parliament petition last week, when all of us can enjoy free trade across the nation, including from GB to NI, as every other independent trading nation enjoys?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I've made it absolutely clear to our EU friends and partners that we want to make our relationship work, but it is also absolutely essential that there should be untrammelled free trade exchange of goods, people, services and capital through all parts of the UK, and we will do everything we can to ensure that that is the case, including, as I've said in the chamber before, and to his honourable colleagues, including invoking Article 16 of the Protocol if that is necessary.
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable...
And we leave Prime Minister's questions for this week, coming out a little bit earlier than in previous weeks recently. Let me introduce our guests for this part of the programme. Robert Courts, Minister for Aviation for the Government, Emily Thornberry, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, and Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, will be here with us for the remainder of the show. And we'll keep across Robert Jenrick's statement, that obviously about housing and the cladding issue, and we'll come to that later on. But first of all, PMQs, and particularly the two, Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, across the dispatch box. Was Keir Starmer any different, firmer tone with the Prime Minister or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was. I think the problem he had today is that he's asking about support, pandemic support for businesses. He's talking about the business rate relief. He's talking about the furlough scheme. And he's asking about that being extended right now. Now, of course, there's a budget on March the 3rd. I think everyone feels that although all the numbers are going in the right direction in terms of cases and hospitalisations, that actually restrictions will be in place for at least another couple of months. So the question is, will all that support be extended as well? And Keir Starmer got the same answer that journalists get, really, when they phone up the Treasury ahead of the budget. And, well, I can't comment on that.
No.
So, I mean, I don't think the Prime Minister was ever going to tell him much. But what he did is he tried to make a theme, really, by saying, why not tell businesses now? Lots of them are really struggling. They want the certainty. Why can't you just say it? We all assume it will be extended. Why not do it now? And he says that's typical of a last-minute dithering, rather than making some kind of decisive move right now. And he linked that to border policy, where we have seen a strengthening of the government when it comes to people travelling into this country with hotel quarantine and all the rest of it. And then really a sort of to and fro about, who's got the toughest border policy. So you've got Australia and New Zealand on one side, who, of course, have been pretty draconian about people coming
and for quite a long time.
And for very many months.
Well, for the duration.
And the criticism of the government here is they've left it far too late. They knew about the South African variant 50 days ago, Sir Keir Starmer says, and the government has failed to act. Now, Boris Johnson's reply to that is, hang on a minute, really, he's saying we're striking sort of in between here, that there are lots of countries, some of them in Europe, who don't have these kind of hotel restrictions at all, and they're trying to find that balance, as they have done all the way through this, of keeping the borders open to some extent because we need to do that because of food and medicine. And Boris Johnson saying normally 250,000 people come into the UK a day. That's down to 20,000, he says, 5,000 of whom are delivering things like medicine and food.
All right, Robert and Emily. But Robert, starting with you as the Minister for Aviation, we've heard that there could be 10-year jail sentences for people who break travel rules, particularly if they lie about where they've come from, a red list country, for example. What law is going to be used to prosecute people in that category?
So this is a tariff that would be used in order to, for the most serious cases. If people have acted in a way that which means that they have lied, if they have covered up the fact they've been to a red list country, and then we need to make sure that people understand quite how seriously that is viewed. And we will be putting the necessary legislation through Parliament.
Right, OK, so you don't quite know yet what law is actually going to be put in place. Will MPs get a vote on it?
So it will take effect as of Monday, but there are reviews through the regular process at which MPs will vote, as they have been on other measures throughout this crisis.
Right, now, two former Conservative Attorney Generals oppose the policy. We heard Dominic Grieve today saying the maximum sentence of 10 years for what is effectively a regulatory breach sounds in the circumstances, unless it can be justified, extraordinarily high, while Geoffrey Cox says, I get that the Secretary of State wants to show that this is serious, but you do have to have regard to the overall balance of sentencing policy and law. Are they right?
So I don't agree with them. I enormously respect both those individuals with their experience, but I don't agree with them on this point. The fact is that if you lie about having been to a red list country, when what we are trying to do is to protect the vaccine rollout, to keep people safe and to look forward to opening up in due course, if you lie and you put that all at risk, then you are potentially risking the health and potentially even the lives of potentially thousands of people. So it's a very serious matter, and I think the British public will expect us to take robust action.
Right.
That's what we're doing.
OK, the British public. Emily, what about you? Does the Labour Party support this?
I think that the British public expect us to take robust action. I mean, it's absolutely right. And what the British public wants us to do is to close our borders apart from getting freight and medicines in. I think for this limited amount of time, whilst we're rolling out the vaccine, we have to do something effective. And this kind of like, oh, you can come from some countries but not from others. You can come from France and America but not from somewhere else. This doesn't make any sense. We need to make sure that we are essentially putting out the message everywhere. I mean, dozens of countries are much stricter than us, and yet we are the ones who have been hit. You know, we're one of the countries that has been hit the hardest by this pandemic, and we need to take some decisive action and get out in front of it.
Right, and Emily, you said a limited amount of time. Just from both of you, I'd like to know, how long do you think these sorts of restrictions should be in place, Emily?
I think we need to make sure that we're putting all our effort into supporting the rollout of the vaccine, and we need to make sure that that is happening so that once we have got to a stage where we don't need to have the restrictions, then we lift the restrictions on travel as well.
Right.
But I can't say at this stage. We need to know, you know, I mean, it's still a long way between many a slip between cup and lip, but we know what the programme is. We've got to get everybody vaccinated. We've got to make sure that we stay in lockdown for as long as is necessary, and we should secure our borders.
Right.
Just do it.
Right. OK, Robert, what about you? How long should these restrictions, all of them, and now the tougher sentencing for people who break the rules, how long should they be in place? When everyone's immunised?
Look, it's very difficult to say at the moment. Right. I mean, we clearly have to have an eye to how the vaccine rollout is going. We're doing incredibly well at the moment with over 30 million people already having been vaccinated. But we also need to keep an eye on what is happening with the variants that, of course, concern around the world and the progress of the virus more generally. The numbers are going in the right direction as they're going down, but we're not there yet. So it would be irresponsible for me to speculate at this stage for how long these measures will be in place for. What I obviously can say is that they'll be there for as long as is necessary to protect public health. But we'll look at making changes in due course. OK, but I mean, you are the Minister for Aviation. I'm sure they would like to know too. I mean, what was interesting is that Grant Shapps, your colleague, the Transport Secretary, said we've got to wait for other countries to catch up. So will it be once everyone is immunised here and also probably around the world before these sorts of restrictions are lifted? I think what the Secretary of State was doing was just pointing out the fact that there are many complicating factors in what is a very complex area of policy, because, of course, we are doing very well on a vaccine rollout. Well, so we'll have to wait till everyone else is pretty well vaccinated before we can lift these restrictions. I'm just trying to sort of find out what it is you mean and what Grant Shapps meant. So, look, at the moment, we can't. You're getting very much into the future, and I entirely understand why you and others would very much want to know what the future progress is. But we've got to concentrate on where we are at the moment. Yes, but there's got to be a metric, hasn't there, Robert? There've got to be some metrics. I know, but there've got to be some metrics by which people will know. I'm not making any judgment about what they should be, but metrics by which people will feel, the government's hit this particular measure and will lift this particular restriction. Of course, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but it just sounds like, from what you're saying and from what Grant Shapps is saying, that actually we are going to have to be a lot further down the line in terms of vaccination, not just here,
but everywhere else?
No, that's not the position that we have. We are obviously considering what the rollout what the rollback rather of restrictions would be in due course. And the Prime Minister is going to speak on this with regards to a roadmap on the 22nd of this month.
Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly what's going to be in it at this stage. I know you'll understand that,
I do.
But we will be hearing more then.
All right. Emily, listening to that, what is your thought? Do you think it will be a case now of waiting for other countries to catch up in the way Grant Shapps described?
I think we do what we can do. So we do everything that we can in order to make sure that our people are safe. And we do that through rolling out a vaccine, and we do that through the restrictions that we have to have in order to get in front of this pandemic. But of course, we are only as safe as our neighbours. And so and we're in a very interconnected world. And for that reason, we need to make sure that we are doing all that we can to ensure that people all around the world are being vaccinated too. And, you know, a lot of work is being done, but more work obviously needs to be done. But, you know, I'm so proud of our National Health Service for what it is doing at the moment, and the fact that we have been able to vaccinate as many people as we have. And we need to make sure that people just get out, and as soon as they get the call, get to the centre and get themselves vaccinated.
Right, and in terms of whether these sorts of policies will work, Robert, I mean, it is a case you can't fly directly, as I understand it, from a red list country, the 33 that the government has listed. But of course, people will therefore come through other airports. So, for example, Madrid or Paris or Frankfurt, whichever airports they can get back into the country. As the aviation minister, are you expecting people to be segregated for those who come from red list countries and those passengers who come from other parts of the world when they come into airports here?
So, of course, you're quite right. If you're in a red list country, then there is a direct flight ban, so you won't be able to come in. And it's worth making the point in any event that, you know, people shouldn't be travelling at the moment. They shouldn't be going on holiday.
Yeah, but we do know that thousands of people are coming through every day for the various reasons that we understand. Hugely reduced passenger numbers, though, at this stage. And
we are starting to
them?
deal now with very small areas. So look, what people have to do is they have to be able to, when they come in, they have to fill in a passenger locator form which tells people where they've been. Everybody has to have a pre-departure test, has to fill in the passenger locator form. You won't even get on an aircraft now unless you've done those things. I'm keen to stress that we do have one of the most robust border measures in the world. I've just referred to a couple of the things that we've done. You've got the enforcement there. Of course, we've now said that you're going to be having another test at day 2, another test also at day 8. So there is a great deal now of very robust border measures which ensure that wherever you're coming from, you shouldn't be travelling at the moment, but you're quite right, there are some people who are, that they will be controlled and that the virus will therefore be controlled as well.
If you come over, let's say, from Calais in a car, and how will we know whether someone has come from France or whether they came first from Portugal and then drove through Spain and into France? How will we know?
So that's the whole point about. So that's the whole point about the passenger locator form. That is why we've introduced the penalties that have been referred to earlier. People need to realise how serious this is. And Border Force are doing a huge amount of enforcement, and that is enforcement we're stepping up. They've already made something like 3.7 million checks as it is, and we're ramping that up further. So people need to understand how serious this is.
Vaccines, ruled out vaccine passports in order to perhaps go to pubs or restaurants. But in terms of travel, specifically for that matter, can you see, Robert, the government looking at, in fact, we understand that they are in discussion with the travel industry about certificates like you might have for a yellow fever jab, for example, so that people can travel or that other countries will know that you've had the COVID vaccine here?
So this is very early days at the moment, but you would expect us to start. Well, you'd expect us to start exploring options. And so, can I see a world in which there may be a combination of vaccine certification and a combination of testing with a view to opening up international travel in due course? I think that's something that probably we'd all like to foresee. But this is really early days, and we're not there yet.
Are you a fan of a vaccine passport for travel, Emily?
I think that it makes some sense. I mean, I think you're right that there are lots of other. I mean, this is not Labour Party policy one way or the other. But personally, I think that if you have, I have within my passport a little yellow card in which I show which vaccines I've had when I'm travelling. And I can see that it would make some sense. I mean, obviously, the only problem is that if if the pandemic keeps changing, so that we might be vaccinated against particular iterations of COVID, and then something new turns up and you're not vaccinated against that. But these are the sorts of things that we're going to need to develop and work out ways of combating.
Right,
Vicky. Ask both of you. There's been a lot of unhappiness or worry that this becomes very divisive. Are both of you saying that we have to wait till all adults have been vaccinated in this country before this can happen? Otherwise, you could be in a situation by early summer where, of course, the older population have been vaccinated, younger people who are less at risk and you could argue have sacrificed a lot of their freedoms for the older people will be unable to travel. Do you think we should wait till all adults have been vaccinated?
I think that whether anyone is going to be able to travel or not in the summer is still it's still a question that can't really be answered, because it isn't just a question for us, is it? It's a question for the countries to which we would want to travel and whether they would feel confident in allowing Brits to arrive in their country given the level of infection that we have.
Robert?
So at the moment, as I say, this is really early. We should be concentrating on protecting the vaccine rollout, which is doing so well. That's why we've introduced the really robust border measures that we have. In the future, we'll look at all options, and it may be that vaccine passporting, has a role, or vaccines have a role to play. It may be that testing also has a role to play. But at the moment, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just protect the vaccine rollout. Everybody needs to follow the guidelines that have been put in place. And with the measures that we put in place today, we'll protect that vaccine rollout, and then we'll start looking to the future.
All right, just very briefly before we move on, will there be an aviation industry once this is over, Robert?
We have a world-leading aviation industry. It has enormous strength. It's central to this country's identity and to its place in the world. We absolutely will.
All right, let's listen to Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Housing, and his statement on cladding. Here he is.
I'm therefore, today, making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England.
Well, that was Robert Jenrick. Greg Dawson, our reporter, has been covering this ever since it began, not long after Grenfell Tower. Greg, just again, summarise the headlines of this announcement and statement from Robert Jenrick.
So 2 key points. If your building has unsafe cladding and is above 18 metres, the government... England. Yes, in England. The government has gone further than the initial promise of £1.6 billion to remediate those buildings. It said now, basically, if your building is above 18 metres, the government will meet that cost. Now, crucially, there are hundreds of buildings that are under 18 metres, with people saying, well, what about us? What the Housing Secretary has confirmed is that the government will provide a low-interest, long-term loan where people will not repay anything greater than £50 per month for the removal of that cladding.
Right, so that means there won't be any costs. I just heard Robert Jenrick saying for remedial works, as he called it, for those leaseholders in buildings above 18 metres in England.
No, but the key point is a lot of them say this is not just about buildings covered in dangerous cladding, but just about fire safety in the building. So lots of these buildings that I've been to have wooden balconies. That's not cladding. They have fire cavity problems. There's a problem with the fire alarm. So this still potentially, well, obviously the Housing Secretary is still on his feet, but it still potentially leaves them on the hook for thousands of pounds of other costs.
Right, well, let's talk to one of those affected. Giles Grover can talk to us now. Hello, Giles. You're in a 12-storey flat in Manchester that has flammable cladding on it. Is that right?
Good afternoon. Yes, I am. We have the same style cladding as the Grenfell tragedy, as well as other serious safety issues.
Now, no doubt you've been listening closely to what Robert Jenrick has said so far. What's your initial reaction?
It's not good enough. It's not a solution at all. It's still dealing with half of the problem. Extending the money is fine, but it's still a fraction of the actual costs that are required. We've still got a range of issues that are not funded, whether it's internal issues with balconies, as has been mentioned, or serious structural issues. And essentially to leave behind the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in buildings under 18 metres is not acceptable. Even if you give us those, sorry.
No, don't apologise. Giles, we have a minister here from the government, Robert Courts, obviously not specifically with responsibility for this, but what can you say to Giles? It's still only solving half the problem.
Well, firstly, clearly we'll never forget the terrible tragedy of Grenfell, and I do very much sympathise with all of those who are in flats that are affected. And what's very clear at this stage is that in addition to the £1.6 billion the government has already said that they'd put in, there is now a very, very substantial further tranche of government help, and I hope that will be welcome. It's very difficult for me to comment upon the specifics of Giles's situation, but I'm sure everybody will be listening carefully to his concerns.
Right. Giles, what would you like to say to the Minister about what should be done?
What should be done is the money should be put up front for all buildings that require remediation. There needs to be a proper assessment of risk for all buildings, not just over 18 metres, because under 18 metres as well. To say that we're going to give you loans to fix issues that just aren't our fault, you can say it's £50 a month, but how long is that for? It might be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It will ruin all property prices. It will push thousands into negative equity. It's not a solution. They need to go back to the drawing board.
Robert?
Well, I would just refer to the very substantial step that the government has taken today. This is a major, exceptional government intervention, as the Secretary of State for Housing has just said just now, and I'm sure all of those concerns will be taken on board. But I do think this is a major step forward that should be welcomed.
Right. Do you think the government will go back, though, and reassess and perhaps look at the situation for people living in buildings of under 18 metres so that they're not getting loans that they then have to pay back, Robert?
Well, you've just heard the Secretary of State speak literally now, so he would have given out a great deal of detail in his statement there. And of course, I'm quite confident that the concerns that have been raised will be heard. Some of them there may be some answers to, and the others will be heard. But I think we should welcome this major step forward, this exceptional government intervention that we've heard today.
Giles?
I could welcome it if he wants, but we know it's not enough. We've been pushing for a proper, full solution for all buildings for 2 years now. And the government's now listening to it because they realise that all the MPs are now fighting it, all the media are covering it. But right now, you're still forcing a lot of people who are trapped through no fault of their own with the same issues in over 18 metres buildings. You're going to make them pay loans. You're going to ruin property prices. It's very dangerous. And you really need to think there's intended consequences and there's unintended consequences. You just need to start again. It's not acceptable. We're not going to take the loans. It's a cladding tax. That's exactly what it is.
Giles, thank you very much for joining us. And Robert, Giles mentioned MPs are now sort of getting involved in fairly large numbers on both sides, but particularly on the Conservative side. We had Jake Berry on the programme before Prime Minister's question saying he wouldn't accept anything less than actually also paying out for those who are in buildings under 18 metres. You'll have a problem on your hand politically too.
Well, I think we should just welcome what the Secretary of State has announced today.
All right. Well, let's welcome that and put that aside. But what about going further? If you're going to have a political problem.
Well, I'm sure all of those concerns from colleagues on all sides of the House will be heard by the relevant ministers, and if they'll consider that policy as they do at all time and keep that under review. But
Emily,
for today, this is a major step forward.
Emily, why should the taxpayer foot the bill here? Why shouldn't it be building companies or manufacturers that have been involved in this? Why should it be taxpayers?
Well, I kind of agree. And the government have promised 17 times that they're going to protect leaseholders and taxpayers when it comes to dealing with this issue. And the issue is about not just Grenfell-style cladding, which in Grenfell, of course, happened 3.5 years ago. It isn't just about buildings that are over 18 metres with that specific type of cladding, but there's all kinds of other things, such as has been said, balconies with wood on. I mean, I have buildings in my constituency that are like that, or we have buildings that are under 18 metres. They're still lethal, whether they're under 18 metres or whether they're over 18 metres, quite frankly. Now, they promised that leaseholders would not have to carry the can, and yet we're now being told, oh, well, some leaseholders will, but don't worry, it's only it's a loan, and other leaseholders won't. Well, and for some type of work and not for others. I mean, we've said that we should do the same sort of thing as been done in Australia, which is to set up a national cladding task force, which will look specifically at these issues.
But it will take time, won't it, Emily? It'll take far too long, and they've already been waiting for years.
Well, 3.5 years, exactly, 3.5 years. But nobody seems, in our view, to be properly getting a grip of this issue. We need to find out, we need to have a proper definition of what is deadly cladding, what is urgent fire safety work. How are we going to make sure that leaseholders and taxpayers are protected, and to make sure that the developers of these properties are the ones who are actually paying the price and not the rest of us.
Emily and Robert, thank you very much. This has obviously got some way to go. Politically, it could be a big issue going on for the government, but also the idea of a task force does sound like it could be too lengthy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of the complaint has been that this has taken so long already, and they really do want to get this solved now. People living in these conditions with this worry is clearly a problem. But I think there will be lots of Conservatives who aren't happy that this has gone quite far enough, without hearing the detail, but they'll hear more about it. But I think this is going to be an ongoing issue for the government.
Robert Jenrick's still on his feet. Greg, thank you very much for joining us, and you, Vicky, and of course Robert Courts and Emily Thornbury for PMQs. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.